Hey, I'm David Adelsheim. The story of Adelsheim Vineyard began in 1971. That was the year that Ginny and I decided to risk our life savings on a piece of property in Oregon's North Willamette Valley. Looking back now, we were one of just 10 families that made wine before 1980 from grapes planted on our properties in that region. To celebrate the 50th anniversary of what became our first vineyard, we wanted to tell our story. But we quickly realized that the only way to truly tell our story was to tell the stories of that entire first generation. Our winery team proposed an idea, a series of video conversations with the founders of those first 10 wineries and me. I loved it and set to work contacting my old friends. In each interview, we wanted to go beyond their widely known histories to discover who these people really were and what led them to build our uniquely collaborative, and at least from today's perspective, incredibly successful wine industry. This is our shared story. Fresh out of college in the summer of 1966, Myron, Redford, and a couple of friends found themselves hitchhiking from Istanbul to London. They ended up in Bulgaria looking for a hostel. Did I mention that Myron had an ulcer and had been told no alcohol? But their guide was pouring shots of Slivovitz, and no thanks wasn't going to work. The next morning, after a long night of Slivovitz shots, Myron was fine. So much for the no alcohol policy. On October 7th, 2020, we caught up with Myron at Amity Vineyards, overlooking the original vineyard he had purchased from Jerry and Ann Preston in 1974. Myron, thanks for opening up the vineyard for us today in the sense of contacting Ryan and kind of agreeing to make this happen. The vineyards behind you are some of the original vines that were planted even before you arrived here.
Yes, in the flats there, there's about 3 acres of Pinot down there that was planted by Jerry and Ann Preston.
And what year would have that been?
They started planting in 71.
Yeah.
They bought the place in 1970, and they started in 71, and I think I first met them in 72.
Yeah. But before we jump into your coming here, I think there's a backstory before that, because you were in Ankara, Turkey, and you were told you shouldn't have any alcohol.
Okay, before I get into that story,
yes,
I want to say, David, that one of the things that we're talking about here is the early industry and what was the most important thing in the early industry: cooperation, and we'll hang together or all hang separately. And I think what you're doing here is a prime example of that. Instead of just going, oh, Adelsheim, you said, I want to set the context, and you're sharing with the industry. Thank you, David. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for recognizing it. It's our staff that came up with the idea. I said, yeah, sure, but...
Congratulations, you guys. You're carrying on the tradition of us old farts. So
we were talking about perhaps stomach issues that led your doctors to say you shouldn't have alcohol?
Right. When I was studying at Middle East Technical University in 1966.
In Ankara?
In Ankara, Turkey.
Yeah.
And
at what age?
Excuse me?
What age?
21.
Okay.
Yeah. I turned 21 in July of 66, so anyway, I had got an ulcer And so I was on what was then an ulcer diet, a lot of dairy and stuff. So then my friend George Goodman and Paul Silverman came down from France and Germany, where they'd been studying, and met me, and we were going to hitchhike from Ankara, Turkey to London, England together. I won't go into all the details, but the important part is while we were in Bulgaria, we got lost in this town in the evening, and a gentleman put us on a way out of town to try and take us to a tourist camp, but we didn't know that. But anyway.
Your Bulgarian wasn't up to speed?
No, and in his language, I mean, between the two of us, we spoke French, German, Hebrew, Turkish, and English. None of them worked. He had about 3 words of German. So anyway, so communication wasn't the thing, but in the end, we ended up in a tourist camp, and we were so relieved, and he was so relieved that we understood he wasn't trying to rob us, that he insisted we have a drink. And as you can imagine, trying to turn down a drink for a Bulgarian who's just done all this for you was impossible. So I drank it, and of course, as soon as I drank one, he went and got others, and da-da-da. The importance of this is it showed me that the next morning, I said, I can drink alcohol. My ulcer must be cured or so forth. So that started my adventure into wine. First, I tried some Bulgarian white wines. Then we went to Romania, tried many different wines. Then up through Yugoslavia and into Vienna, Austria, where George had aunts and cousins. And we went to the Höringen, yeah. Your German's better than mine. Where the little vineyards outside of Austria where you go and drink the young wine. It's sort of like a white nouveau.
That's got to be a real trial for a person with an ulcer.
Yes. By that time, Dave, I was sure that my ulcer was cured. So anyway, the important thing in terms of my being here in Oregon is that on that trip, I fell in love with wine. And in Germany, while we were on the Mosel, I got my first experience in terroir, drinking at one Gasthaus, their Tafelwein, table wine, wonderful, 30 kilometers up the Mosel Valley, stopping at another place, garbage. I mean, and I said to George, how can the same grape, it's only 30 kilometers away, be good here and bad there? And anyway, that started my search into wine, and it continued.
And that was still a number of years before you ended up here in Amity, Oregon.
Yes.
I mean, you grew up in Seattle area,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I was in Seattle, and after the time, and I graduated from Antioch College in '68 and came back to Seattle, and after a while got a job at the University of Washington. I was assistant to the vice provost for academic affairs. And while I was there, I started taking trips to the Napa Valley to continue my exploration of wine. And so I was very interested in wine, and my mother was a research librarian, and we were having lunch in the faculty club. And I heard these guys at the next table talking about vinifera wine in Washington State. Well, in 1970, the only wine you could get in the state of Washington in grocery stores was Washington wine. And it makes Nuico seem like Chateau Latour. So I just interrupted them and I said, guys, what's this? What are you saying? Vinifera wine in Washington State? And they said, yes, yeah, we've been making wine at Associated Vintners for 4 years. I said, really? And they said, well, come on out. Associated Vintners was founded by a group of university professors, and they started out as an amateur group and ended up having to turn commercial because they bought a vineyard and it produced too many grapes. So anyway,
and just to finish that story, it became Columbia Winery at some
right.
point. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. But anyway, the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Lloyd Woodburn, was the winemaker. The head of chemistry department was the chemist. The head of the
They better not have had any instabilities in the wine.
What?
They better not have had any instabilities in the wine.
Right, right. And you didn't want to mess with them legally because the head of the law school was a lawyer. So anyway, David, I ended up working with them off and on for about 2.5 years. And 1 year, unfortunately, Boeing went down worse than it is now. And I lost my job at the University of Washington. And so I worked for AV almost a full year. And so I began to get the bug, not just for loving wine, but wanting to make it. And that's where it started. By the time I was, had been there 2 years, I started buying dairy tanks to do fermentations and stuff. And I was really hooked.
And were you, during that time with Associated Vintners, were you involved in the winemaking?
Yes.
Got it.
Yes. When I arrived in Oregon in '74, I had a lot of experience in the cellar. I had no experience in the vineyard.
So you're in Seattle. As I've heard from you, you had a piece of property on the Olympic Peninsula in Port Townsend.
Yes, that's where I was going to plant grapes and put my winery because I had a barn we were going to convert.
This is not Port Townsend.
You know, although the fog is sort of similar to
Well, the clouds have lifted, so perhaps
just going away. No, what basically happened is a friend of my mother's gave me a reference to visit Jerry and Ann Preston, who bought Amity Vineyards in 1970, planted it in 1971, this vineyard right here that we were talking about earlier. To make a long story short, Jerry and Ann got divorced, had to sell the vineyard. So when I came here in '73, they weren't here. I didn't know how I was going to get my grape plants that I had bought from Jerry for Port Townsend. Then he calls me several months later and says, hey, your grape plants are here. When are you going to pick them up? And I said, okay, I'll come down and pick them up. And we came down, and that was happened to be the time on the weekend that the what were they called? The North Willamette Valley?
No, it was the Oregon Viticultural Development Committee.
Oregon Development Committee. Invited Ralph Kunke up from UC Davis to talk about sterile bottling of German white wines. And the whole industry was there. I mean, everybody. I mean, the whole industry could fit in this room, of course, because, and so I was just, here I was, this young kid, maybe 23, 24, and I'm in this room with all the founders of this industry. And then after the lecture, we went out and drank, and then we went and drank a little more, became more friends, and the next morning we went around and compared hangovers with Charles Corey, and I can't remember. I think, well, maybe Erath. But so I was just in this wonderful experience of seeing the whole industry at one time, and it really made an impression when we got back to the vineyard to pick up the grape plants. 3 Mercedes pulled up, black Mercedes. Every guy that got out was named Paul. That just blew my mind. And so I was digging up the plants, and Jerry's talking to them, and I said, Jerry, you told me you'd sold the vineyard. He said, well, the sale fell through. I said, oh, well, could I make you an offer? He said, well, I didn't think you had the capacity, and without going into all the gruesome details of banking at that time.
Or lack thereof.
What?
Or lack thereof.
A lack thereof, you know. They didn't loan on out-of-state property. They didn't loan if the security wasn't in their county. So my mother, without me asking her, this is very important because my mother was a Depression child. No credit card until she couldn't rent a car when she was in her 70s. She just said, Myron, okay, I'll mortgage the house. My God, Mom, you're going to do that? She said, yeah. So we got the money from the mortgage, and myself and my partner at the time, Janice Czechia, moved here in May of 1974. I had $10,000 that my brother, who had died in '73, had left to me, and this property, and I built that winery behind you there in 1976 for $15,000, plus the winery equipment that I had with it. And nobody could believe it, because even back then it was astounding.
Yeah.
I mean, we were down here taking apart chicken coops for the aluminum for the roof, which ended up getting changed when a tornado came down right in this parking lot and tore the upper section of the roof off. And so, anyway.
So this is not the original roof.
No. So anyway, my brother and I visited Domaine Caneros. No, not Domaine Caneros. The one that's connected with Mum, David.
Oh, it's the main mom, yeah.
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 And we were watching, and the degorging process was going on, and Steve says, Myron, look at that. They put the bottles on their head, they get all the sediment, and then they open the thick crown, and it just goes out. He says, we're going to do that with all our wines. He says, because, you know, we're trying to impress the girls when they come by, and we take out our beautiful old wines, and the sediment gets there, and they go, hey, good night. So anyway, so I've stored my wine on a cork ever since, and this is the process. And as I always tell people, I've never had a problem with it until I was in front of 300 wine riders in Newburgh, and my finger slipped, and I put it all up and down myself. So, okay. This, by the way, is the first bottle of Gamay I ever made, which is the first Gamay in...
Probably in the U.S.
Yes, true Gamay.
Nice.
There we go.
And you didn't get it on your pants.
Yeah. So let's see, David. This is from 1988.
1988 Gamay Noir.
Gamay Noir.
Gamay.
Everybody knows that Gamay is an early grape and doesn't age.
Pretty nice.
Yeah, it is.
It's
isn't it?
really Gamay-like.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's
the thing that drives me crazy often with Gamays in Oregon is that they often are so tannic.
Yeah.
This is, if it was tannic when it was young, it's aged out of it now.
Yeah. It only took 22 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Thank you for being willing to open that. So,
That's my next to the last bottle. The last bottle is over there. So. My pleasure.
thank you. What a great thing. This is really part of a story of, there's a central story about the wine industry that has to do with particularly Pinot Noir. Also has to do with several white grapes, certainly Chardonnay originally, and then Pinot Gris, and then a number of other white grapes, and now back to Chardonnay. You weren't content with just a variety or a couple of varieties. I mean, you went first in the direction of Nouveau, and then when Gamay became available, you went in that direction.
Yes.
So what was your thinking on that?
I don't know. A lot of it probably was just, oh, that tastes good, let's try that. But back in those days, everybody told us that Gewürztraminer was a very early ripening grape, which is nonsense. So I decided we had a little bit of Gewürz here, and people had a lot out there and offered it. And so we already had Riesling here, we had Chardonnay here, Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, we had Cabernet. We had,
That was Jerry's planting?
yeah, Jerry planted a phenological block. You had one at your vineyard also. So we had an acre of 30 varietals, 5-6 plants each. But on Cabernet, he had done a larger planting, a row and a half, and so forth. And then up the road, the guy that was living there wanted Cabernet, and so I got his grapes. So we made, my brother Steve was with me from 78 until about 81, and his love was Cabernet, so he made Cabernet under his Redford Cellars label. And then when he left, I made one Cabernet under the Amity label. And then the next grape initiative was the Gamay. In 1987, OSU released the French clones, and I had been on the panel evaluating the wines from the different clones. Because everybody, French, oh, yeah, we want that. Yes, it's French. And as we found out, several of the clones were not particularly appropriate. And some people think the ones that we chose are a little heavy bearing and so forth. You mentioned. Anyway, so that's the wine that I have here, and that's Gamay. And then I was always a bit of an iconoclast, and I decided, I think it was in '88, about the same time as this, that I wasn't going to use any new oak anymore, because I felt that back then people were over oaking their wines, and at the same time, I said, I don't want to have these Chardonnay with all that oak in it. So I drafted all the Chardonnay over to Pinot Blanc here. Now, you and John Paul at Cameron and Ponzi.
Well, they have it now, so maybe
Yeah.
they had it that early. I don't know.
Yeah, anyway, we're all the early pioneers, but I formed a Pinot Noir promotion group.
Pinot Blanc.
Pinot Blanc, thank you. I remember our slogan was Blancs have more fun.
That's right. They're T-shirts.
Yeah, we made t-shirts. I did that for about 2 years, and then I ran out of energy and nobody else wanted to. But anyway, I got really invested in Pinot Blanc, and we made Pinot Blanc. And then in 2006 or 7, Liz Dodd and, not Liz Dodd, anyway, Liz and Darcy were my assistant winemakers, and they wanted to make Chardonnay. So we started making a little bit of Chardonnay in 7 or 8.
You know, mentioning the Blancs Have More Fun reminded me that of the Steamboat Conference, and we were latecomers to the Steamboat Conference. We didn't participate until the third year.
What?
We
Third year?
Third year.
Yeah.
But you were there in the first year, right?
Right. I was part of the group that founded.
Who was that group, and what really is the Steamboat Conference thing?
Well, the key person who unfortunately has died is Steve Carey. Was the winemaker at Yamhill Valley for a long time. Before that, he was the first distributor of Oregon wines nationally.
Broker, yes.
And he'd take, like, I think one thing we had 17 winemakers on a trip. Can you imagine? It was like herding cats. But he did this incredible promotion for Oregon wine nationally. Anyway, he and
Mike Richmond. And the guy from the Jim something from the Port Place?
Olson.
Jim Olson.
Jim Olson
Yeah.
became the Port Works.
Yeah.
And then the restaurant fellow that had the restaurant in Northwest Portland.
Jim McLaughlin? Mike McLaughlin? Bill McLaughlin?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were a group, and that's where the idea originated, from their sort of tasting together. And then he came out and started talking to the industry. And at that time, he was working for Henny Hinsdale, and I was one of his wineries.
Yep.
And
what was the idea that was put into practice that year, 1979?
What we wanted to do is to get Pinot Noir winemakers from all around, from everywhere, not just Oregon. So I think the first one, we had winemakers from Oregon and California, and I think there may have been one French, but I'm not sure. Anyway, and the original concept was we were going to have 1 year in Oregon, the next year in California, and move back and forth. The California part of it didn't work out, and everybody loved Steamboat. Is a small resort on the North Umpqua River, just 40 miles east of Roseburg. Gorgeous place. And guess what? It just happened to have fly fishing. And guess what? All of those people I mentioned, who Steve Carey and friends, were all fly fishermen. So fly fishing ended up bringing the winemakers together at Steamboat. The center focus was no press was allowed. And it was sort of like an AA meeting in the sense that everybody could confess their sins. And people were encouraged to bring bad wine because the thing wasn't to have a beauty contest, it was to learn how to make better Pinot Noir. And I remember the year that the Californians came up and introduced the concept of adding acid to Pinot Noir in the fermenter. Before this, California and Oregon were letting the grapes hang to get the ripeness, And then when they went through malolactic, the pHs were so high that the wines looked like this, and they were, and all of us Oregon purists, adding acid. Now everybody does, except me. I got my grapes from cool sites, and so I only added acid, I think, once in 40 years.
Wow.
And I know you and I were on a panel in the LCBO had a Pinot
Liquor
Noir.
Control Board in Ontario.
Yeah, and you got up and talked about how you make Pinot, and then I got up and I
Said the opposite.
basically, yeah. I mean, our two approaches were, and it highlighted the diversity of approaches to Pinot Noir that exists in the state, and it also highlighted that the source, the locations where you get your grapes from, also influence how you make the wine.
The Steamboat Conference, in many ways, is, I think, contributed two important ingredients to the industry. One was the collaboration. I mean, once people started finding out about this, that it was this opportunity to learn, they wanted to be part of it. And virtually every American winemaker who's known for Pinot went through Steamboat at one point or another.
Yeah.
That was expanded in 1987 when the French started coming to IPNC, the International Pinot Noir Celebration, and they were invited to Steamboat the week before that, and many of them came, and that expanded the Steamboat Conference from just being Oregon and California to being quite international, people from New Zealand, from Canada, from pretty much everywhere.
Interesting point in terms of my influence in the industry. I was the one that told Larry McKenna, who was a winemaker in Martinborough, about this conference and told him he should get his ass up to the Steamboat. And Larry came up and then encouraged some of his colleagues to come. And the outgrowth of that is the Southern Hemisphere Steamboat Conference, which I attended once.
Yeah.
Have you attended?
Yeah, I did once. Yeah. No, and I mean there are outposts of Steamboat in Australia and two different places in New Zealand that alternate them at this point. But the Steamboat Conference is still going on in Steamboat as well every summer, and probably now close to a third generation of winemakers are going through this.
Yes.
Learning techniques, but just as importantly, learning what it means to be a Pinot Noir maker in Oregon or in the US, and the collaboration that is encouraged in that universe.
Yeah. I think that is. All of us were kind of worried. I know that Mike Richmond and Larry, his sidekick, Larry.
Yeah, I know.
Anyway, several of the early people from the industry came to the first conference after Stephen Carey had died, and sort of wanted to make sure that the young'uns were felt comfortable going on, and they took it over and have been running it, which is wonderful.
Yeah. No, it's pretty cool. So we got you to buying this vineyard and even building
this winery, or this barn, as everybody refers to it.
What were those early years of being in the industry like? Who were your friends in the industry?
Well, when we first came here, as you know, there was maybe, I think there were 10 wineries in '76 when I got my bond, 10 in the state. several of those were fruit and berry wineries, and or two. So it was a very small community. And Dick Ponzi and I were both cheapskates, and we respected the need to economize. So we started sharing equipment.
Yes.
And I had a 1952 Ford pickup, and I remember driving from here to Ponzi's, which is about 40 miles.
Over at least one mountain.
What?
Over at least one mountain.
Yeah, and no, I never went over Bald Peak when I was carrying, because we had a labeler that we were sharing, and it was top heavy, and it fell out of the pickup once. But anyway, Dick and I shared the equipment. He'd pick it up, I'd pick it up. Then we bought a filter together and did that. So I had a lot of interaction with Dick and Nancy and the two girls and Mikkel. And so that was a real close. And then while Curry was around, Curry was part of the group. The Willamette, North Willamette Wine Growers Group met at the Tiger Fire Hall for 10 years maybe, but in that early period prior to 1980, almost everybody was there. And then after the meetings, sort of a hardcore group would go to the tavern across the street. But interesting thing, I think it was probably 1980 or maybe, we all cheered because it was the first time that the wine group could drink Oregon wine at a meeting. Because prior to that, Ponzi, Lett, Curry, Erath, they had such small amounts of wine that being able to buy a bottle from them was a big deal, and they weren't about to come and give it away to their colleagues when they were trying to do it. So we were always drinking California jug wine. And then that one year, finally, the industry got big enough that somebody was willing to sell us Oregon wine so the Oregon winemakers could drink it. But anyway, Curry and I, Jerry Preston, while he was still around for several years, Erath, I think, we tended to drink a little more than some of the other people, and so we sort of...
You were helping the economy of Tigard.
Yeah. And so I got to know them. I didn't really meet you in formal sense until you were a waiter at Willamette.
Yeah, I've conveniently forgotten a visit that you paid to Willamette with a number of other vintners, but you told me about that.
Yeah, we were, I can't remember, there must have been a growers meeting, or I was on the agriculture committee with Gary Fuqua. It may have been that group. So I got to know several growers. Gary was the chairman. But anyway, there was a group of us, and Omelette was the hot restaurant in town. And so we managed to get a reservation, and we had this incredibly neat waiter who was also one of our colleagues in the industry, you. And it was a mark of the cooperation of the industry that you said, guys, I can't serve you dessert because, we're packed and I got another group coming in. Would you mind if you just went and had dessert someplace else? And we all said, okay, David, we'll do it for sake of industry cooperation.
Well, I had a bunch of Oregon wines on the list at that point, so I had some leverage.
Yes, yes, a lot of leverage.
So this planting this winery
Yes.
were the first in this region.
Yes.
And this region, what's more formally known as the Amity Hills at this end, and then across the road, the rest of the Yola Hills is the Yola Amity Hills, AVA, American Viticultural Area. Was that, I mean, in the beginning, there weren't a lot of people south of McMinnville planting grapes.
No, there weren't. The first person was Don Byard. He planted, and then I think he went in 78 over near where it is now Brooks Winery.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, Brooks has bought his vineyard.
Yeah.
And Don was very active. He started a little group, mainly of growers, that would meet once a month. It's still going on.
Yeah.
So that was but it wasn't restricted to this AVA, but most of the people were from around here.
It was more Salem-centric than...
Right, yeah, because the big plantings were Bethel Heights, and then O'Connor, Pat and Patty O'Connor planted that vineyard, which is now
Zenith.
Zenith Vineyards. And so they had that large group, and then Witness Tree over on the side, and what's now Christum.
Yeah.
It was first planted by a Californian.
Yeah, California winery cousin. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, they were only there for a couple of years. Yeah. But as you said, most of that, and it was Canary Hill also down there, Dick and Nancy. So that most of the focus was on the other side of this road.
Right.
And it was later that people started planting on the Woodland Heights on the other end here. And then Kristen Hill was planted over here, but the vast majority was there. And the Castilles and Janice and I spent a lot of time together. And then Vicki and I, we were very close because Marilyn and Ted Castile both were at the University of Washington at the same time I was working there. Marilyn was in the student activities department.
I thought she was in the dean's office. But anyway.
Yeah. And then Terry was the head of some students' organization. And I was regarded as the enemy, the administrative spy. But when we came down here, we spent a lot of time together. And I think I sort of helped mentor them because I had more experience in winemaking. Of course, Ted became an incredible grower. Terry became a good winemaker, and his son is now there. But that was a north-south coalition. Don, yeah.
You know, that reminds me, you said earlier that you had the experience at AV making wine, and so you arrived with a certain confidence in winemaking.
Yeah.
But not necessarily in grape growing. How did you acquire expertise in the field of viticulture?
Well, I think like most of my colleagues in the industry, we learned by making mistakes. And when you thought you'd made every mistake you could make, there was always a new one that showed up. I have a vivid memory, David. We had a D2 cat that Jerry had that we used for farming. And back then you had a pony motor, and you had to get the pony motor gasoline started, and then that motor turned over the diesel. And I still remember being out there in the field and trying to push that damn clutch and get this. and cursing to high hell. But I got it going, and my brother, who had always been kind of mechanically oriented, when he heard that I was down here, working on equipment and getting things to run, he was flabbergasted.
That there was any level of success at all, you mean?
Well, we had grapes. We had grapes, and yeah, we got the job done finally. Yeah, but when we arrived, it was May, right? The vineyard hadn't been pruned.
So how'd you do it?
What?
So how did it get pruned?
Me and Janice, we pruned it.
Following what?
Jerry Preston came over and helped us. I think he was our major tutor. And, you'll love this, David. So Jerry comes over, I think we'd been here 2, maybe 3 weeks. Comes over and says, "Hi, Myron. What's going on? I noticed the vineyard isn't pruned yet." And I said, "Jerry, it's raining like hell out there. I'm waiting for the rain to stop." Jerry was laughing so hard. "You dumbass. You usually prune your vineyard when it's snowing or raining in the winter, not in the middle of May. Get yourself some rain gear and get your ass out there." And I wouldn't say some of my fondest memories, but some of my most vivid memories are kneeling next to a grape plant in the mud with the rain coming down.
So at meetings of the wine group, whatever organization it was, whether it was at the fire station or subsequent to that, there was always there was likely to be something that would raise your ire, that would get you really pissed off. And we all lived in horror of that because we never knew what it would be or when it would be or what direction it would go. And but inevitably, perhaps not every meeting, perhaps I'm exaggerating a bit.
Probably.
But it seemed like you had a strong focus of what was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was being trespassed upon, there was a need for correction.
Yes. And well, you're right. I sort of was regarded as the volcano, and it's a little sad because when you become the volcano, then people, instead of listening to what you're saying, just say, "Oh, that's Myron, the volcano," and but I'm trying to think of a real specific thing because I know I'd get ticked off at little things. At the moment,
that's fine.
I'm blocking. Of course, I was always ranting and raving about the oak levels in the wine, and I think another thing may have been there were efforts underway, which I was very supportive of, to get Oregon was bifurcated. There was from Eugene north and Roseburg south, and near the twine could meet. And even when we had, we started out with the wine the
Table wine research advisory.
Table wine advisory research and so forth. We always had this conflict And I felt very strongly that we needed to become one group. And I probably was fairly vocal at the people, because there were several of them who said, those guys down there don't know anything about wine. Their association is just to get together and have wine and drink and have dinners. They're not focused on, like we are, on important issues to the wine world. And some of them were very condescending. And so that was something that I spoke up about when, and then when I was on the wine advisory board, after we had formed a united thing and so forth, I was very vocal with my colleagues from the South when they were being short-sighted, that I felt they were being short-sighted and not, they were sacrificing things that were good for the overall state because it wasn't beneficial enough to them. And I got in some fairly strong arguments about that. But yeah, you know, I'm kind of a volatile guy, and I tend to get emotional about things and sound off.
Well, I think on balance, though, that helped keep issues in discussion that might otherwise have been papered over and not necessarily resolved.
Well, I hope so. I was a very active member of the wine community. I can't remember when I first got on I was with Gary Fuqua on the Agricultural Research Committee, which in the early years we were all focused on improving, how do we improve grape growing and things, and we were working with OSU. And I was part of Barney Watson, the OSU wine advisor at that time, his winemaker group that tasted his experimental wines and gave him feedback. And Barney and I are really good friends.
You started, when you first bought this vineyard, Janice was your partner.
Yes.
That lasted a while, and eventually Janice found other things, and eventually you and Vicki became partners and got married, and
There was 24 years in between.
well, I don't want to be too specific here, but one of the things that I'm seeing as we're talking to this group of 10 wineries is in Yamhill County, women often had to sort of fend for themselves in this wine business. That the guys were typically the winemakers, were often involved in the grape growing as well, and it didn't leave, at least initially, a clear role for women. I'm happy to say that that's a very changed universe today, but in the beginning in the very beginning for you, was Janice actively involved in pushing forward all the work at Amity?
Yes, but the problem was, as I said, we came down with, I had $10,000, and so after our unemployment ran out, we didn't have any money. And, you know, it's one of the traits. You were a waiter, Ponzi was teaching, Erath was working for electronics, Wolstech the same. Most of us were small wineries, had minimal resources and had to work. And so Janice got a good paying job, and I had to find a job that would allow me the flexibility to be a wine grower. And so I ended up taking a job with the unemployment office. But Janice was the breadwinner in the family. She brought in the steady income. And as I said, in the early years, she was out there pruning with me and so forth, and active in that kind of thing. And once I met Vicky in September of 1980, and she is fairly aggressive, I guess, isn't a description. Assertive, thank you, yes. If we say aggressive about a woman, it's a wrong. A very assertive woman, and she became quickly involved in the sort of the marketing side. She was involved in the founding of IP&C, worked with that for several years.
And she was still working in medicine as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, she was a nurse.
Yeah.
Every time I'd say, she's got a full-time job, lots of money coming in, she would come and go back to school. So, but she was not involved. Well, I take that back because she had a laboratory experience from being a nurse, and so she did the lab work.
Oh, wow.
A lot of lab work here for me, and she had a very good palate and was involved in the blending decisions. And as I say, she, well, you know, we had the first big wine festivals. I was sort of an outlier in that I wanted to reach out to the common man, you know. So we had the Nouveau Festival where we took a barrel of Nouveau to McCormick and Smith's, and then it ended up traveling all over the place, and she helped organize that, did a lot of our publicity, so forth, our Summer Solstice Wine Festival. And we had a Winter Solstice Festival for a few years. She worked on those.
You know, we had skipped over the Nouveau
Yes.
innovation
Yes.
because that came before the Gamay, right?
Yes. It came in 1976. The first wine I made was a Nouveau.
And had you had experience at AV with that, or was that just because?
Well, it's interesting, Dave. When I bought the vineyard from Jerry Preston, he had a label all set, Beaujolais. It said Beaujolais on it. I don't know whether I've still got it.
God.
And this was back when Beaujolais was being used all over the place.
Well, it couldn't have been used that way, but yeah.
Well, this was before we had our labeling.
No, I mean, even then it wouldn't have been, I don't think.
They were using it in California all over.
Yeah, with Gamay, yeah.
No, not with Gamay.
Really? They were calling wines?
Well,
Beaujolais?
yeah, but they had Napa Gamay
Yeah.
and so forth. Anyway, to make a long story short, I needed, as I said, I was financially strapped all the time, and I needed cash flow. And so I said, if we make a wine that we can release in November, we can have sales immediately and get cash. And so I was focused on that, and the grapes that were in this vineyard were labeled Gamay Beaujolais. You know the history of this. It's the upright clone of Pinot,
Right.
but there's Rex Hill made a Gamay because one of the growers that I sold cuttings to thought that the upright clone was Beaujolais, so it was Gamay, and so forth. But that's how I got into it.
And it must have worked.
It did. It also, I got to tell you this. Want a little more wine?
Go, pour yourself.
I think I've told you this, that which arose by any other name will smell as sweet, but it won't get the same amount of money. I made Nouveau, and it was a nice, fresh wine, and I could have brought a bottle of Nouveau, and it holds up. But it was regarded like the French Nouveau, that it was drinking it after Christmas was sort of
Past its time.
And as my production of it got a little higher, it took longer to sell and so forth. My friend Jim Bernot, I don't know how many years ago.
Willamette Valley Vineyards.
What?
Willamette Valley Vineyards.
Willamette Valley Vineyards released a whole cluster Pinot Noir. Exactly the same thing that I was doing with Nouveau. I think the highest price my Nouveau ever got to was $12. It was mainly around 10. He came out with whole cluster Pinot Noir at $20 or $22 a bottle, sold like hotcakes. You know, he'd sell out of it. In 1994, one of the best vintages in the last century, I got a call from my distributor in August saying I had to take back Nouveau, my 94 Nouveau, because they had a pallet and it was August and they couldn't sell it. And it was incredible wine. It was one of the best ones I'd made.
But if you rename it.
Yeah, if I had. Yeah. I just stopped making it. I said and I had Gamay by then, but I didn't, the thing about Gamay in Oregon as opposed to Beaujolais is that Gamay is a later ripening grape, almost a week, 10 days after Pinot. And it often wouldn't be done, wouldn't maybe even have started malolactic by November 21st. And November 21st, as you know, was the date that the French released their Nouveau. They actually changed it to the third Thursday in November. If you didn't have your Nouveau out in the market on that day with the stuff, you lost a third to a half your sales.
Wow.
And so I could, when Gamay came along, I didn't want to do it because I was still making Nouveau and I didn't want two Nouveaux. And secondly, the style of Beaujolais I like the most is Beaujolais Village. I tend to think that some of the Grand Crus in Beaujolais are sort of trying to make Pinot Noir using Gamay. And I like Gamay for a luscious, easy drinking wine. Excuse me, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I remember one of the things you asked me that we hadn't covered, and I wanted to cover it because I want to talk about my friend's winery, is you said, why did I keep going back to Turkey after I was there in '66? And the simple answer is I had good friends there. But it later became intertwined with the Turkish wine industry. I graduated, I attended Ankara College, which was a prep school in Ankara that taught classes in English and Turkish. And I am an alumni of that. And I went to some of our reunions. And at one of the reunions, I found out that two other of my colleagues, both Turks, well, one's a Turk, lives in the United States, I think he's now an American citizen, had wineries. And so suddenly here was this oblique connection. And this label, Celendi, is made by Aachen Onger, and Aachen and I have become good friends. And he makes lovely wine, and I visited his vineyard.
And is that in, there's a, when I was in Turkey a couple years ago, we were only in Istanbul, and we had a lot of wine, particularly from the European part of Turkey.
Right.
But
A lot of Gamay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the big region is the big fruit region in Asia Minor.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the name of it, but it is a...
I was trying to remember that this morning when I was typing all the notes for this, but it's north and east of Ankara.
Yeah.
I was going to bring a bottle of Turkish wine for us to open, and I forgot. But there's a Turkish white grape called Narince that is absolutely fantastic. You were talking about me, and I tried to find it, but it isn't in the United States. And so otherwise I would have planted it, because it makes very, very nice wine. And it's, oh, wait a minute, Kirk. I almost remembered the town. But anyway, near Amasya, yeah. They grow that grape, and then there's two native Turkish red grapes that are, I don't remember their names, unfortunately, that are quite nice. Well, I guess we've sort of hit my work as an innovator with the Gamay, and also the one other real major innovation.
Yeah.
I made the first organic wine.
Yeah, that's right. You did. I mean, I kind of, from today's position, it seems like a perfectly normal thing. But when you did it, it was
Not.
And why did you do it? And
Okay, it's interesting. It's sort of one of those happy accidents. We bought our present home in 1987, and we had about 5 acres of Italian prunes on the place. And in either late 87, early 88, I went over to my neighbor who had been farming prunes since 1928. And I said, "Howdy, say, could you tell me what the market price is for prunes?" And he said, "Market price? Son, if you don't have a contract with a cannery, you don't sell your prunes." I said, "What?" I said, "Well, you have a contract with a thing. You've been here since 28. Son, my cannery closed, and now I'm in the same state that if they need my prunes, they do. If they don't, they just drop on the ground." So I said, "Oh, bullshit. I don't want to deal with that." And I thought the organic movement was starting, and I thought, I wonder if there's a market for organic prunes, because my orchard had been untouched for several years, many years, and so I could qualify as an organic orchard right away. I didn't have to wait 3 years. So I went in and got certified as a orchard, and found a way to sell my prunes for a while. And so I were talking about that. I was buying grapes from Bill Cattrall. Bill and Tom Cattrall have a vineyard over here. It's one of the first vineyards planted probably around the time Bayard was planting. And they have always farmed organically. And Vicki said to me, "Well, look, you got a source of organic grapes. Why don't you make an organic wine?" And so we we did in 1990, but it's mainly focused on the fact that it had no sulfites in it. What I call the environmental fascists said, well, if you use sulfur dioxide in your process back then, you can't call it organic. They've changed. So we said, well, what the hell? We'll try making the wine without any sulfite. So we made it. When we got done, we sent it to, the BATF was doing tests on wine back then. And that's the federal government's labeled people. And we sent it to a commercial lab, and they both showed no detectable sulfites. So we named the wine Eco Wine, and then said sulfite-free Pinot for 8 years before the feds said, I'm sorry, we've given you permission for 8 years, but you can't use it anymore. So anyway, so that's how I got into the organic thing. And in the early years, the main selling point, Dave, was that it was sulfite-free, because all these people who think they are allergic, and the ones who are allergic, my God, they'd buy cases of it. And selling it as an organic, you'd go into a wine shop and say you had an organic wine, and they would, oh. And I remember when we were getting ready to release that wine, I and a bunch of friends went out and got every organic wine we could find. Some of them were, you pick up the bottle and there was clouds of, I don't think one of them was drinkable. And I'm pretty liberal in what I'll drink, if occasion. So it was horrendous. And now organic is chic and long journey.
Yeah, but you were the first to do that in Oregon. Mm-hmm. What else did I leave out?
Oh, my innovations.
Well, that was one.
Yeah, the organic wine was one. Gamay was another. But one of the most interesting ones is I was responsible for floating lids becoming available in the industry. JV Northwest, you remember them?
Yep.
They were a bandsaw originally, it was another company, the owners of JV Northwest left, that made bandsaws for the lumber industry. And these guys had come out and talked to me and said, the lumber industry is sort of going down. We need to find something else. And I said, why don't you make a wine tank with a floating lid? And they made their first tank for me. And then they went out and promoted it. Scott Henry, it turns out, had heard about it in California, and he was using them too. But that's one of my promotions.
Yeah, no, we bought no small number of those.
Yeah. And let's see, what else? Oh, the Oregon Wine Tasting Room. That actually is a pretty important piece of the story. Yes. And I started the Oregon Wine Tasting Room for two reasons. One, back in 1980, I was selling my wine so fast that I didn't need another tasting room to sell it. And I can't remember whether it was Vicky or so forth, but we got this idea, well, why don't we open a tasting room for all Oregon wines, and then, your wine will just be a minor part of it, and you can get some more income. So I went down and talked to Gary Lawrence in 1980,
Gary Lawrence had a art gallery.
Yes, had an art gallery on Highway 18 at Bellevue. And he said yes and gave me this little room. And I hired Patrick McGillicuddy, and the rest is sort of history. Patrick became the face of the Oregon wine tasting room. But at one time, Dave, in those early years, probably 80, maybe up to 85, we had every Oregon wine that was selling outside their tasting room. And we did a lot of promotion, and a lot of wine writers stopped by there, and a lot of good things happened for people.
Yeah. I mean, at one point it was almost a monopoly. If you wanted to actually taste what was going on, that's where you had to go.
Right. That's right.
Because so many, particularly in Yamhill County, there weren't a lot of wineries with their own tasting room.
Right.
Washington County, a bit more, but
Yeah.
further away from Portland, the thinking was, that's another business. Can you afford to be in it? So we really our tasting room was your tasting room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that worked for quite a while. Are we going to open a bottle of your wine or not?
Do you want to try our Gamay?
Well, I would love to.
Well, I'll bring this out and we'll hand it over. So we're.
Do you want to?
So you made the first Gamay. I mean,
Yeah.
I was responsible for those plants coming into the country.
Yes.
But we never, other than just the little clonal block, we never really did much, and that always went into our Pinot.
Yeah.
But one year in 2007, we made a Gamay Noir. I don't remember it being great, but if you would open that, I think we should
Okay.
try it.
Got it.
Nice.
Okay.
I've been shaking this up for 2 days, so who knows?
It's a little different color. See? Why didn't you guys get excited about Gamay?
I don't know. Partly because we didn't have that much planted. I mean, we had, what would it have been, like 60 plants or 65 plants, I don't know. I mean, I can imagine a winery that just makes Gamay and Pinot Blanc.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that'd be a cool winery if you didn't have a lot of overhead and you could get away with prices in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And
nice.
stay alive. It's pretty good. Actually, yours is slightly richer in the middle than this. One of the interesting things to me is people always ask, why don't you try this variety? Why don't you try that variety? Why do you have so much Pinot Noir planted? Wouldn't it be better to have a bunch of different grape varieties?
Yes.
And there is some logic to that, but
you come from the Burgundian tradition, so.
well, maybe I don't.
Yeah, come on, Dave.
But the other piece is, look at all the work that it's taken on our parts to make Pinot a success.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just the steamboat conferences and all the time that we meet as small groups talking about Pinot. When we started doing something like the Steamboat Conference for Chardonnay 5 years ago, the quality of Chardonnay shot up because suddenly everybody was seeing each other's what they were trying, and they were stealing the best stuff. And so that instantly changed. Well, we've never done it with Gamay. We've never done it with Pinot Blanc. We've never done it. I mean, a couple of times people have tried it with Riesling. But all these other varieties don't have the focus and striving for quality that we've had since 1979 with Pinot Noir.
79.
First, well, the first
steamboat.
the first steamboat,
Right.
where, I mean, obviously it was before that in terms
Right.
of people planning it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. But they, you know, the thing that distinguished the Northern Oregon group from the Southern Oregon group way back when I arrived is almost every one of our meetings was technical. There was always something on how to make it better, how to grow it better, and so forth. And I think that we focused on it. But I think you're right that steamboat was an incredible, wonderful thing. And then for helping Pinot Noir become a thing, the IPMC was,
International Pinot Noir Celebration.
yeah, it just was a brilliant idea,
Yeah, yeah.
you know.
So here we are, what are we, 50 years after you bought?
74,
So not quite, 46 years,
48,
48 years,
46 years, you're
46 years
right. Yeah.
after you bought. So was it a success?
See?
Was it a success?
Well, you know, it's sort of what an incredible journey it's been. It's had its ups and it's had its downs, but it's been, you know, the industry's full of really good people, and the sense of cooperation. My brother made wine here and then went up to Washington, and I remember him calling and complaining about something. I said, well, why don't you just go ask your neighbor to borrow a piece of equipment? Myron, this is not Oregon. You know, and you know, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun, and it has been incredibly interesting to see us go from a bunch of urban refugees going back to the vineyard, most of us not knowing what the hell we were doing, to an industry that is so successful that we can now get millionaires who can't afford Napa, but they can afford us, so they come up here. I mean, that's a whole different stage, because in the early times, the people that came here were people who were passionate about growing grapes and making wine. They were mainly owner-occupied, or the owner and the winemaker, or the owner and the vineyardist were the same person, and that kind of thing. And so we've made the transition. We've grown into a real industry, you know, where now I would say probably well, maybe not by numbers, let's say a large portion of the industry now has professional winemakers with an owner. And that's been a change, but I think it's just part of the maturation. And I'm happy I sold Amity when I did. These folks that bought it, Union Wine Company, are incredible. The winemaker and his wife, Mandy's the one that did this garden, and I've gotten to know them, and you know, I got to know you a little bit, you know. As I tell people, I still remember you carrying your daughter on a log over a river.
Yeah.
all of us are going, Dave, don't drop Lizzie.
It wasn't like it was deep water.
What?
It wasn't like it was deep water that
No,
she would
it
have fallen
wasn't.
into.
No, but it was Yeah, we were all there, and that was part of the camaraderie. We'd go to Steamboat, we'd work our butts off, and then we would go play, and in the evenings drink wine and socialize. And I think Steamboat, I think I went to every Steamboat but one, until Steve died.
Wow.
And I think it's, yeah. But, yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for today. Thank you for all your contributions to this industry that it is today. And what fun to be back here at Amity Vineyards, even just for this morning.
Yeah. And thanks again for you for doing this multiple winery presentation of your 50th year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're very happy about this.